Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. We've been hearing that the traffic is brutal, but the audience seems to be quieting down, as good Midwestern audiences do before the start of something. So it seems like it's time to get started. I'm Deborah Shapiro. I am a retired librarian, and I was teaching faculty at the UW-Madison iSchool. And I'm a board member of the UW Friends of the Libraries. And welcome to this event. The Friends is proud to partner with the Center for Journalism Ethics, the Department of History, and the Center for Campus History to bring you tonight's presentation. I'm going to begin this evening with a land acknowledgement, recognizing the place that we're standing on, or sitting, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the Friends. And then I'll introduce our main event. The University of Wisconsin-Madison occupies this land, de Jope, land inextricably connected to the Ho-Chunk people since time immemorial. In an 1832 treaty, the Ho-Chunk were forced to cede this territory, and decades of ethnic cleansing followed when both the federal and state government repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove the Ho-Chunk from Wisconsin. Our land-grant university could not have been established or sustained were it not for state and federally sponsored settler colonialism that dispossessed and displaced American Indian nations and communities across our state. We must now confront the outcomes of unjust land treaties and the harm caused by our university's past complicity with policies of cultural and physical genocide as we seek reconciliation with indigenous nations and communities of Wisconsin. With a spirit of humility and openness, we pledge to do the hard work of reflection and truth-telling so that we can move forward towards transformative healing. The Friends. For 75 years, the Friends organization has been championing our great library system here at UW-Madison. We are an all-volunteer organization that strives to bring visibility to campus libraries and to the world-class collections they hold, and we encourage students to consider careers in academic libraries and archives. That I spent 23 years doing that. Our activities are made possible by donations in two forms: money and used books. You can give to the Friends at any time, or in particular, Giving Tuesday is coming up November 28th. If you prefer in-kind giving, donate your books to us, and we will include them in our two book sales, our two semi-annual book sales. Both methods allow us to raise money to provide grant support to UW-Madison libraries and to scholars who come from around the world to use the exceptional collections in our libraries, and also funding for a wide array of free public events and lectures like this one. If any of this sounds interesting to you, we invite you to join us. Look for us on social media or on our website. And now, what you're really here for. It's my great pleasure to introduce Samuel G. Freedman and his discussion partner, UW-Madison Associate Professor Kathryn McGarr. Since graduating from UW-Madison in 1977, Samuel Freedman has authored 10 books, worked as a columnist and staff reporter for the New York Times, co-produced a radio documentary, and wrote numerous award-winning articles for The Washington Post, The New Yorker, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, and many more. His books have been finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. In 2017, Freedman won the Goldsire Prize for Journalists and the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching at Columbia University, where he currently teaches. His most recent book, Into the Bright Sunshine, Young Hubert Humphrey and the Fight for Civil Rights, is the subject of tonight's event. Kathryn McGarr earned her PhD in history from Princeton and an MS in journalism from Columbia University, where she was a student in some of Freedman's classes. Her BA is from Stanford. Kathryn is the author of 2 books, the political biography, The Whole Damn Deal, Robert Strauss and the Art of Politics, from 2011, and City of Newsmen, Public Lies and Professional Secrets in Cold War Washington, from 2022. She teaches classes here at UW-Madison in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication. So without further ado, please welcome Professors McGarr and Freedman to the stage.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you so much, Sam, for wanting me to be here to be your conversation partner.
No, there couldn't be a better one. It's ideal that you have this connection to Madison that builds on the connection we had from class. I can't remember, what year were you in the book writing class?
15 years ago.
15
exactly,
years ago.
In January.
I guess that Kathryn was such a star that I think she was probably the envy of everyone in her doctoral program at Princeton because she had a book contract before she even went into that program.
Well, your class changed my life. Sam teaches a book writing class. So 15 years ago, this time of the year, he was deciding if I should be allowed. He was very skeptical that my first book should be written, but then was as supportive as I ever could have hoped for. Sam, congratulations on Into the Bright Sunshine. It's been so incredibly received. Rave review in the New York Times. And it's the biography of Hubert Humphrey we didn't know we wanted. But we did, and it's a wonderful book. I've heard you speak about not wanting to write a white savior story, but wanting to focus on civil rights. So can you talk a little bit about how you navigated that and what was different in your approach?
Sure, I promised to do that, but if you'll indulge me for just a sec to give some thanks for this event, is that okay?
Please.
Libby Thune at the Friends of the Library and Katie Barson-Culver at the School of Journalism and Mass Communications were just exceptional supports in pulling this evening together, them among other people, and I'm very grateful to them. It's always really meaningful for me to be back in Madison because I went to school here. I'm here with my wife, Chris. We met here in a class taught by Professor Evelyn Beck in Complet in the fall semester of 1976. And then the last thing is this book has 3 names on the dedication page. One is Chris, one is the late Alice Mayhew, my longtime book editor, and the third is one of my dear friends who I met my very first week on campus here in Madison, Jim Podgers, when he was campus editor of the Daily Cardinal, and I, rode my bike down there with a story about an accident involving a swimming float overturning and clonking someone on the head by the Lakeshore dorms where I lived. That was the first of many great edits I got from Jim over the years, and he was an inspiration, a great, great friend through all that time, someone who I miss every single day. You can't say that of everybody you lose, but Jim is on that list, and his sister Patty, his wife Sis, his best friend Leo are all here, and that also makes it so extra special. So, Jim. Now to answer the question, and thank you for indulging me. I think when you take on the subject of civil rights, first of all, when you're a white writer yourself, and then when you're going to have a significant white person in the book, sort of first among equals in the characters, as Hubert Humphrey is, there's a real risk that even if you don't intend to, you're going to make it sound like the civil rights movement was something that idealistic white people did for black people, which is, of course, a real distortion of the history. And yet what Hubert Humphrey did was incredibly significant. To be a Caucasian in this country who really committed to civil rights in the 1940s, I think there's a really short list for that. That's Humphrey, by my lights, that's Humphrey, Henry Wallace, and Eleanor Roosevelt. But I also knew that I had to constellate around Humphrey people who influenced him, people who taught him, people who inspired him, people with whom he partnered. It was beyond being an ally, it was really being a partner in this cause. And so, from the very beginning of work on the book, I knew it wasn't going to be sort of Hubert Humphrey from page 1 to page whatever, that it was going to be important to find the other people around him, black people, Jewish people, since his battle was very much also against antisemitism as well as racism, women who were close to him and whose opinions he took seriously because he was very ahead of his time in his attitudes about gender, and then to find places for all of them in the manuscript. And I didn't think that took anything away from Humphrey. I felt it actually situated him more accurately in his historical moment.
Yeah, for those who haven't read the book yet, some of my favorite chapters are these really deeply reported histories of racism and antisemitism in Minneapolis. Can you talk about your connection to Minneapolis?
Well, it started in the summer of 1977 when I got an internship on the Minneapolis Star, which was then a separate newspaper. And my claim to fame was that Amy Klobuchar's father, a legendary columnist up there named Jim Klobuchar, was on the paper. And occasionally, as the low person on the newsroom hierarchy chart, I would be assigned to take dictation of his column over the phone when he was doing it from the field. But that was the beginning of my time in Minneapolis. As my wife Chris and I got together in 2007 and beyond, and I spent a lot of time there for family reasons, I got to know it better. I got to know a couple of scholars who've done really groundbreaking work on the underside of Minneapolis's history, this supposedly blue city that actually was nationally infamous for most of the first half of the 20th century for its racism and its anti-Semitism. So getting to know Dr. Ravel and Prell, who's actually down here presenting at UW just last week, and Kirsten Delegard, their work was really important. But it was a pure happy coincidence that this book ended up bringing me even more to Minneapolis, a city that I knew something about and where I had family ties through Chris. I was thinking for like 20 years about a book in the post-World War II years that I felt like there was a lot of literature about the war, understandably. There's a lot of literature in the 50s about suburbanization, about the Cold War, about that decade of civil rights, all deservedly. But I kept on thinking, there's so much less comparatively about what happened in this country between 1945 and 1950. And it was a period when the country had to decide what kind of country it would be. And that was a really pregnant question after the defeat of fascism abroad, when there's such an unfinished agenda at home. And I just never found the right way to tell it. And actually, your mentor at Princeton, Julian Zelzer, who's a friend of ours as well, was giving a book talk for a book he did about LBJ putting through the Great Society legislation. And Chris, being a good displaced Minnesotan, asked, what about Humphrey? And in the course of answering that, Julian mentioned what became the crescendo of this book, which is a landmark civil rights speech that Humphrey gives at the 1948 Democratic Convention that compels the party to endorse civil rights for the first time ever. But it's one of those landmarks that kind of no one knows is a landmark, or not enough people know is a landmark. And as soon as Julian said it, on the way out that night, I said to Chris, that's the book. And then I just made sure Julian wasn't going to write it himself. In which case I would have had to, arrange a truck to hit him or something like that. But then I was off and running.
So tell me about the process of writing this book and how it was different from your other books, because you're famous for your observational reporting. And so tell everyone what that is if they weren't in your book class, and also what kind of archival reporting went into this book.
Sure. Well, I think you certainly can understand this. You made this transition way faster than I did. You did it probably within your year of J school. It took me decades. But my first books, as is the case with a lot of the journalists who start writing books, were built very much on my journalist skill set. I did embeds, basically. The first one was about an embed with a brilliant teacher and her students in a very poor, almost entirely immigrant public high school in New York City. The second one was an embed with an amazing minister and his congregation at a black church in the East New York neighborhood of Brooklyn. And a lot of that was doing what one would do as a reporter. You hang out a lot, you interview people about their lives, you observe them, you take a ton of notes in your thin little reporter's notebook. And I enjoyed that process, but after doing two of them, I felt like, okay, I've learned how to do this kind of book, and I don't want to keep repeating myself. To me, that would be death professionally. And so since then, with almost every book I've done, the balance between interview or observation and secondary source work versus primary source research has tilted increasingly towards primary source research, because that's where I felt the greater challenge awaited me. And so with this book, maybe 5% of it is interviews, because I'd only interview people with firsthand memories of events. And since most of this book ends in 1948, there weren't that many people with firsthand memories, even when I started my work in 2015. Then maybe 15% is secondary sources, largely period newspapers. And then the rest, the other 80%, was archival work. And that was just a blast for me because I had never done it to that extent before. And I should say that some of that archival work was right in this building in the collected papers of the Americans for Democratic Action, which was this really important group of the anti-communist liberals that Humphrey was part of, and a group that really pushed civil rights within the Democratic Party at the 1948 convention. But it was, I'm such a newbie, though. I see historians like you who know how to do this, know that you go into an archive and you bring your scanner or your smartphone and you hang out for 2 or 3 days and take scans of 3,000 pages. Right? I am right about that. And bring it back and then work on it in your own time. I didn't realize that I would sit there, mostly at the State Historical Society in St. Paul, Minnesota, where Humphrey's papers are, and go through folder after folder, box after box in real time, and take little notes on my laptop and stop. Something would stop me in my research, like who is this person who wrote a 16-page hate letter to Hubert Humphrey because the way he stood up to the white nationalist Gerald L.K. Smith. And I might stop and do some quick research online. But basically, it was just sitting in there day after day, week after week, month after month, going through all of Humphrey's family and personal papers and all of his public papers up through 1948, and then some of his correspondence as senator and vice president to see who popped up from earlier parts of his life, still writing to him or him writing to them later on. And then there were other archives, some of which I visited in person, some of which, because of pandemic, I accessed digitally or made requests. And that ranged from, A. Philip Randolph, the great black labor and civil rights leader, his papers at the Library of Congress, Harry Truman's Presidential Library had a lot of papers that were relevant to me. Their papers at Fisk University of a sociologist named Charles Johnson, who Humphrey had brought up to Minneapolis to study the racism and anti-Semitism of the city. So it was just kind of identifying the different tranches and spending the time with them. And I can just seriously say I loved every day of the work on this book. And the going slow and going page by page just kind of seemed to work for me.
And you used the word fun to describe the archive, and that's also what I love. I mean, it's so much fun. I can't believe we get to do it for my job. And it's sort of hard then to capture that for people who don't do archival work. What is fun about it? What's something you found that was fun? Why is it so great?
Yeah. Well, as I sometimes tell my students in the book writing class I teach, which now, I guess because of the direction of my work, is steering more and more into teaching journalism students how to do archival research. Yeah, I know.
I was the only one doing it when in 2009.
Well, you were a rarity. There are very few people come into Columbia J School who have the experience or the motivation to do archival work. But some people, when they discover it, wonderfully get bit by the bug. But what I say to them is, to do this work, you have to love the hunt. And so I love the hunt. And in terms of specific discoveries, there were amazing letters that Humphrey and his first girlfriend and then wife Muriel wrote back and forth to one another, particularly in 1935 in the middle of the Depression, when he has stopped out of college to help his family survive with their little drugstore in small-town South Dakota, and he goes to visit his chronologically younger but influentially older sister Frances in Washington, and goes to see Congress in session, and goes to the Smithsonian, and goes to monuments, and is writing letters twice a day, because there's delivery twice a day at that point of snail mail. It wasn't very snail-like then. And he and Muriel are writing back and forth, and he's saying, basically, I know you think I'm crazy, but I feel like this is my purpose in life, is to be in public service, to walk up the steps of the Capitol one day. And she's writing back and saying, no, it's not crazy at all. Your dream is my dream, but you're going to have to leave your father's drugstore. She recognizes he's been too loyal a son. And she's the one who's able to urge him to extricate himself, get back to finish his bachelor's degree, and then the rest is the history, at least the history that's in this book. So that was a really great set of letters. There were very moving letters during World War II. Humphrey really wanted to serve, partly to be part of the battle against fascism, partly because he knew that pragmatically, if you want to have a political future, it would look very odd not to have served. And he kept on getting deferred. He had a double hernia. He had 1, 2, then 3 kids. He was in his 30s. And by the way, none to stop Bobby Kennedy from in the 1960 presidential primaries smearing Humphrey as a draft dodger when he was running against JFK. But anyway, so Humphrey had an exchange of letters with a young German Jewish refugee who'd made it to Minneapolis because he was a native German speaker, was, after he was drafted, sent to be an interpreter at a camp for Nazi POWs in Nebraska. And he got to know Humphrey during Humphrey's first unsuccessful run for mayor. And Humphrey's writing to this fellow, John Neumeier, and saying, how lamenting how he can't get into the military. He feels so worthless at the time of this great moral cause of the fight against fascism. And Neumeier writes back this amazing letter and basically says, hey, we actually don't need you firing a gun. You should hear what the American soldiers at this base say. They say that we're fighting this war for the goddamn Jews. They say that why do we have to treat those son of a bitch N-words so well? You got plenty to do at home. So finding a letter like that and realizing Humphrey had read it also was really affecting. And to be honest, seeing the volume of hate mail he got every time he stood up for civil rights, he was deluged with hate mail. And it's just a reminder that we can look back and think, to have been in favor of civil rights, to have pushed through fair employment law, okay, yeah, that's great, but so safe, big deal. Well, it was an immensely big deal in the 1940s, and the wrath of the hate mail attested to that.
And the attempt on his life. Do you want to tell that story?
Yeah, there was an attempt. I'm just going to go quick. I want to show you this. We'll quickly scroll through. So when Hubert Humphrey was mayor, he put through a civil rights program that included the aforementioned law against employment discrimination, a law against discrimination in housing, a police reform program that tragically he never got to complete before he went to the Senate. And he was and he also brought in a black sociologist, and one I mentioned before, Charles Johnson, to force Minneapolis to study its tawdry, disgraceful history of bigotry. And Humphrey actually was quite a popular mayor. And in this moment in 1945, when he was elected right after World War II, a lot of people did come back from the war with the idea we have to fix our problems on the home front. But there was also an enormous amount of resistance. And so one night in early 1947, Humphrey's coming home from, typical mayoral night on the rubber chicken circuit. And he'd already had one credible death threat against him that the police chief had alerted him to, so he'd avoided the path of the would-be assassin that night. And he was getting police protection coming home from City Hall every night. But this night, Humphrey had his police officer driver also give a couple of aldermen a drive home. And Humphrey, being Humphrey, said, Officer Bartholomew, you can, take the alderman home. I'm fine, from the curb. And as he's walking without his police escort to the front door, and weirdly, the closest street light is out, and then he's fiddling with the key in the front door, 3 bullets whiz by his head. And in a way that's amazing now, Humphrey kept this out of the papers for 6 weeks and went on, undaunted, pursuing his civil rights agenda. But the cops, meanwhile, worked the case. The FBI worked the case because this hate mail kept on coming in. And eventually they found this guy here, Maynard Orlando Nelson, who had a house full, and you can see it there, of guns, knives, a map of World War III, correspondence with white supremacist groups around the country. And he was almost undoubtedly the person who shot at Humphrey, although Humphrey never brought charges, I think, because he didn't want to let him play the martyr at a trial. And the kind of important background to know is Nelson was a follower of this guy, who I mentioned before, Gerald L.K. Smith. And Gerald L.K. Smith was the founder of the America First political party and political movement, and was a genuinely dangerous man in this country. He had a big following in Minneapolis. One of his advocates there was a senator named Ernest Lundeen, who I don't know if any of you have heard the fabulous Rachel Maddow podcast, Ultra, which has a lot of Venn diagram with my book. But in Ultra, she came up with the detail that I wish I had had, which is that Lundeen was giving speeches, isolationist speeches that were written by a Nazi agent. That's not an allegation, that's provable and proven history. And so Humphrey would tangle with Gerald L.K. Smith repeatedly, and that plus his civil rights program in Minneapolis led Nelson to try to shoot him. So, again, that gives you a sense of just how bold and how risky it was to take the stances that he took at that time.
What was motivating him?
Humphrey had a lot of motivations. In a way, I could start it right here when he's 11 years old. This is where he grows up, in this tiny little town, Dolan, South Dakota. This is a very vanilla place. It's almost entirely Protestant, Northern European, Scandinavian, British Isles. What they consider a minority group out there are the Catholics who live in a town 10 miles away. And, it seems funny, the Catholics is the oppressed minority, but no kidding, the Ku Klux Klan would regularly go outside their town and burn crosses just to remind them how tenuous their existence was. But Humphrey's father was a complicated piece of work in a lot of ways, but politically was very admirable, liberal in a conservative town, an agnostic in a town where everybody went to church, and really taught Humphrey to be open-minded to other people. And so kind of the first stage in his development for civil rights is when he's 11 years old, the first gravel road is going to be built connecting Dolan to the Twin Cities, which is a big deal because prior to that, Dolan was really only connected by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, and that meant that the farmers there were subject to monopoly price setting for their grain and for their livestock. So this gave them an alternative. And of course, it was in the local paper, and which made note in a little 3-line news item about the fact that the road crew putting down the gravel was this black-owned company from Omaha, owned by two of these three brothers, the Shipman brothers, Leslie and Otis. And when they come to Dolan in the summer of 1922, when Humphrey's this 11-year-old with his pet dog, I think inspired by his father's example, Humphrey goes out and introduces himself and befriends them. And so it's this kind of amazing revelation that he would feel this curiosity and this open-mindedness towards black people in this very insular, very nativist, very closed-minded place. But that's just sort of one early step. The next thing that happens is years later, after he's finished his degree at the University of Minnesota in 1939, he goes to LSU to grad school for a year. He's in a one-third black city, Baton Rouge. He sees a Jim Crow society in action, and he's appalled by it. He makes Jewish friends on the debate team, and he studies with this man, Rudolf Eberle, who was a part Jewish, anti-Nazi, exiled professor from Germany, whose lessons for Humphrey are all about how democracies become dictatorships, and who says explicitly the way the Jews are treated in Nazi Germany is the way black people are treated in the Jim Crow South. But the important thing is Humphrey doesn't think that's just the South. He goes back to Minneapolis after the grad school to the city of nativists like Charles Lindbergh, who's on that previous slide. And these men are the final step in his moral education on civil rights. Cecil Newman is a former Pullman porter who founds and runs a series of publications most famously and most enduringly, the Minneapolis spokesman, the black newspaper of record. To this day, his granddaughter still edits it and publishes it. And this man, Sam Shiner, who was a lawyer who couldn't get any law firms to hire him because he was Jewish and was making his living as a jazz pianist until the Jewish community, which was really alarmed by the popularity of Gerald L.K. Smith, the popularity of a pro-Nazi group called the Silver Shirts, and the blasé attitude the Minneapolis establishment had about right-wing extremism. So they pulled together the money to put Sam Shiner on salary, basically to be a one-man anti-defamation league. And what he really did was do intelligence gathering on the right-wing extremism in Minneapolis. And what Cecil Newman did is a combination of editorial writing, investigative reporting to expose all sorts of forms of bigotry along race in Minneapolis. And I think a key thing for them and for Humphrey and for my book is that Cecil Newman and Sam Shiner were very close friends, and they understood the battles against racism and anti-Semitism were one battle. And they understood that battling against Hitler abroad was the same thing as battling against people like Gerald L.K. Smith and the Southern segregationists and the Silver Shirts at home. And they became Humphrey's teachers. And Humphrey was their advocate in political life. And it's the triad of Newman and Shiner and Humphrey that makes so much of what happens possible.
So how did your opinion of Hubert Humphrey develop in the 8 years you were working on this book?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm 68 years old. I remember indelibly watching the 1968 Democratic Convention as a 12-and-a-half-year-old or 12-and-three-quarters-year-old. And I was from a very political family. My parents were Gene McCarthy supporters. That year, they were typical people who felt very betrayed by Hubert Humphrey's support of the Vietnam War. And then I'm watching the Chicago police beat down the anti-war protesters, the journalists, and Humphrey gets the nomination against that backdrop. And even though he came out with a very credible Vietnam peace plan during the campaign, this was the Humphrey I knew. And I was in college here at UW, reading Rolling Stone, buying it at what used to be called the Lakeshore Store down by my dorms along the lake, and reading Hunter S. Thompson describe Humphrey running for the nomination in 1972 as campaigning, quote, like a rat in heat. And so I didn't still hold on to those views of Humphrey when I started on this book, but I also didn't come in saying to myself that he has got to have his reputation rehabilitated. I had an intellectual and historical interest in writing about him and a big interest in writing about that period of time. But in the course of doing the research, my admiration for him really soared. And I didn't want to exculpate him for Vietnam. He doesn't deserve it. He himself didn't feel he deserved to be exculpated for it. He owned that mistake late in his life. But the moral courage that this guy had, the literal putting his life on the line, it just couldn't help but really impress me. And also that he really understood his role as a white Christian wasn't to do for blacks and to do for Jews out of however good intent. It was to partner with them and to be ready to be taught by them about their own experiences. And also, as I said before, and I haven't had enough time to really talk about this at length today, his attitudes about gender, his marriage, his companionate marriage with Muriel, who he took totally seriously as a political advisor, his relationship with his amazing sister Frances, who was as a protege of Eleanor Roosevelt's active on civil rights before Hubert was. When he was still out in the drugstore in South Dakota, Frances was helping Eleanor Roosevelt desegregate, a major hotel in Washington, D.C. So that stuff, too, really had an effect on me. So I'd say that my opinion of him very much grew in the process.
And I should add that you don't whitewash him because his sister and his wife both get upset with him for neglecting them at certain points in his career. So.
Absolutely. I mean, he both was better than the gender norms of his time, but benefited from them. You know, when he was the mayor, he was out giving speeches every night. He'd be in his office reading every single letter that came in and directing the staff how to respond to them. And in one respect, that's really admirable. In the other respect, it left Muriel doing all the emotional labor. You know, I mean, all of it. And then he'd come home at 10 or 11 o'clock and want to talk political strategy with Muriel because he did respect her intellect, but she was doing everything else. And I think with Frances, yes, she felt slighted by him that he wasn't keeping in touch as much with the rest of the family. But I think that's a little different in the sense that I think she was feeling something that he couldn't by himself redress, which was she was brilliant, idealistic, politically savvy, and knew by the gender limits of that time she would never get to be a senator. I mean, she later did become a really significant person working for the UN Association, working on some of George McGovern's congressional and senatorial campaigns, you know, really had this kind of political salon in Washington, but she should have been a senator too. There's no doubt about it. And she deserves a biography of her own. And so that was the way in which, even though Humphrey was forward thinking in a lot of ways, he had these built-in male advantages that Frances and Muriel absolutely did not.
Will you tell us more about the Humphrey family and your interaction with them and who's left and who you interviewed?
The Humphrey family, well, the most important thing is that his son, Hubert Humphrey III, who is still called Skip from his childhood nickname of Skipper, he is the executor of the estate. And this goes to your earlier question about archival work. There are two sets of Humphrey's papers at the State Historical Society. One are public papers. Anyone can walk in and request those. But the really interesting ones are the personal and family papers. That's where his correspondence with Muriel, with Frances, with his father, all that good, you know, intimate stuff is in that collection. And you can't work in that batch of papers without Skip's permission. So he gave me permission when I started on this in 2015. Who knows why he trusted me, but fortunately he did. So
you're Sam Freedman.
Well, but you know, but he didn't know me until that I came totally over the transom.
Yes, Google. You're very well known.
Well, I guess Skip would Google. I'm not sure. I'll have to ask him. But and Frances's son and daughter, Bill Howard and Ann Howard Tristani, were really key on looping me in with, you know, how important she was with him. So the family has been really supportive, and in a way that I think writers dream about, because they opened doors, they were always accessible, they did nothing to impede me, they didn't want an airbrushed portrait of him. I didn't give them any rights of editing or prior restraint, but when the book was done, I showed them the manuscript and said what I always say, which is, if I made any errors of fact, you know, tell me and I'll correct them. And if anything bothers you, I'll hear you out. I don't promise to change anything. But I think they might have caught a couple of errors, like, you know, Frances's husband was an army doctor, was grievously injured in a Nazi attack on a U.S. troopship called the Dorchester, and I had the wrong name for the Dorchester, and like Bill or Ann caught that. So they caught a couple minor things, but there was no effort at all to change my analysis of him, to change what I had written. And if anything, they were very supportive of saying, you know, I'm finding out stuff about my father, my mother, my uncle that I never knew before. And that was really fortifying to hear. So they were really all one could ask for.
Are you hearing from people who have changed their mind about Hubert Humphrey, maybe a little bit like you did, or who you've corrected misconceptions that they had when you're out promoting the book?
That's a great question. No one has asked me that question at any event. Thank you. And I was
trained by Sam Freedman.
You're doing it. What I've gotten a lot of is, now I know why my parents thought about Humphrey the way they did. A lot of people of my generation or a little bit older, you know, who came of age during the Vietnam War years and had the view of Humphrey that was very common in the anti-war movement and the counterculture at that time, had liberal parents who, futilely had tried to explain to them why they felt this deep attachment to Humphrey. And a lot of them have written to me and or emailed and said, now I understand, why my parents felt about Humphrey the way they did. A lot of people who grew up in Minneapolis, if they grew up there Jewish or Black, have said, I'm glad you told the story of this very problematic city that I experienced. And there are other people who grew up in Minneapolis and didn't realize that, who responded and said, I never knew, thank you for teaching me this, I never knew this part of Minneapolis's history. Although, again, I don't think I'm the person who broke that ground. I built on the work that Ravel and Prell and Kirsten Delegard and William Green at Augsburg University did, to give credit where credit is due. But those have been some of the themes. And I think, back to the way you originally phrased the question, people in my generation, I think now, are more curious to maybe re-explore Humphrey because of seeing this other side.
Will you tell us a little bit more about being on campus here in the 1970s and sort of what you did, what stands out to you in your memory? It could be a class, it could be a story you worked on. Tell us something, slice of life.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Well, of course, the single greatest thing was taking a class from Professor Evelyn Beck in the literature of death and dying, which was not only one of my most memorable classes, but was where Chris and I, each of us had lost our mothers at a young age, ended up in that class, and that has made my life so much better in ways I can barely express. But, being around the Cardinal was a real intense experience. This was Carl Armstrong of the Sterling Hall bombing had been captured and was on trial the first semester I was here. The university was trying to shut down the Black Student Center the first semester I was here. So I was immediately deeply plunged into, partly by covering those things or knowing people who covered them for the Cardinal, the very, very intense, hard-fought, bitter, invidious political life of Madison. It made you grow up fast, as a journalist. And being, I had a double major in journalism and history, and, I still remember from journalism, Mary Ann Yodel's great class on law of mass communication, which was my favorite. In history, there were so many extraordinary professors. I had Eugene Boardman for modern Chinese history, Stanley Schultz for urban history, and a great class in pop culture, Thomas Archdeacon for immigration history, just so many great things. And then, the friendships and the influence, again, I have to come back to Jim Podgers, he was so ahead of his time. I mentioned this anecdote in my book, Letters to a Young Journalist. When no one our age would admit to liking Sinatra, Podgers loved Sinatra. And he'd be really busy at campus as campus editor of the Daily Cardinal. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in the Cardinal office, but the decor is like early bomb shelter. And it's literally, there are no windows in there. So you're like in the even more brutalist basement of Brutalist Vilas Hall. And Jim would be in there working long hours as campus editor, but he would have put in an order at, I believe it was Campus Records, that was on State Street. Do I have that right? Was it called Campus Records? Maybe I'm getting it wrong, but it was right on that first or second block up on State Street. With Discount Records, thank you. Everyone needs an editor. So Podgers would order a couple of Sinatra albums, and he'd be busy, but he'd give me like $3 a piece, which is what an LP costs then, to go over and pick them up. And I'd be so ashamed that my friends might see me carrying a Sinatra album. So I'd find a Jethro Tull album, something now I'm ashamed of having had. And I'd carry Podgers's Sinatra albums held tight to my side with the Jethro Tull album sticking out, and go back to the Cardinal. But, part of his influence on me was exposing me to jazz, sometimes often late at night after a football weekend or after the Cardinal or someone's party, hearing this great jazz show from Rochester, New York called The Best of All Possible Worlds, hosted by Harry Abraham. And when the clear channel was hitting the clouds the right way, you could get this Rochester jazz show on his car radio. So I think, it was also formative. My wife and I did a lot of listening to the jazz scene that Jimmy and Jeannie Cheatham led here at that time. So I think a lot of my listening life, as well as a lot of my writing life, actually began in Madison as well.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that we're going to turn it over to the audience for questions.
Yeah, sorry to go on so long sentimentally. Occupational hazard.
If you could wait for a microphone to be brought to you because this is being recorded, that would be fantastic.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm wondering if you could explain some of the contradictions regarding Humphrey. I mean, he's also the legislator that advocated for concentration camps in the post-war period for leftists or maybe communist dissidents and others. He advocated that they be built. He was also responsible for the betrayal or the attempting to press a very ludicrous compromise on Fannie Lou Hamer of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that they could seat something like just 2 of their delegates alongside the all-white Mississippi delegation in '64. So, I mean, there were those contradictions.
Oh, yeah. There are definitely contradictions. I don't know about the concentration camp thing. I do know that he voted for the McCarran-Walter Act, which was a despicable piece of legislation, and Harry Truman vetoed it. Hubert Humphrey was a Cold Warrior. I mean, I've never bought in with the idea that he supported Vietnam only because Lyndon Johnson pushed him into it. I think, like Johnson, he within himself went back and forth on the war, but he was very capable of persuading himself into it because he was a Cold Warrior. I'll spare you all the inside baseball here, but suffice it to say, there were incredibly vicious battles over the control of the Democrat Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota between 1946 and 1948. Battles between people who actually were members of the CP USA, people who were allied with the CP, either knowledgeably or not, as Popular Front supporters, and then anti-communist liberals, including Humphrey. And these people went at each other with no mercy. Humphrey was called a fascist. Muriel was roughed up physically trying to go into a DFL convention. Humphrey and his friend, but also his hatchet man, Orr Freeman, purged people who'd been their longtime allies. It was not pretty. And it left Humphrey, I think, very prone to overinterpret national and global affairs through the prism of the battles in the DFL. There actually was an effort by people in the party to take over the DFL. That's reality. I'm from a very left family, so it doesn't give me any pleasure to say that, but it's a historical fact. But Humphrey's big mistake was it made him a soft touch, whether it was McCarran-Walter or the Vietnam War, that, there really was this vast communist conspiracy out there. With Fannie Lou Hamer, just to contextualize for everyone, at the 1964 Democratic Convention, Mississippi sent, as it usually did, a segregated all-white delegation. The Civil Rights Movement and SNCC particularly had worked on what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which sent an integrated slate of delegates to challenge the segregated slate. And this was a big battle at the convention, and Lyndon Johnson was terrified this would become the big news story of the convention and would hurt his chances of re-election. And he was also upset because he had just put all this political capital on the line to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and didn't feel like he should have his civil rights chops challenged, but they were being challenged. So basically, LBJ was auditioning 2 people to be vice president, Humphrey and Gene McCarthy. And his audition for Humphrey was, you have to go to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, whose general counsel, Joseph Rao, is one of your best friends, and tell them, we're not going to seat all of them. we're only going to see 2 of them. And Humphrey did it. It was his audition. He passed it. It ruptured his friendship with Joe Rao for the rest of his life. But I will say this, in the longer view of history, it worked out, because what happened was once the Mississippi Freedom Party got 2 seats, the Mississippi all-white delegation walked out anyway. And the rest of the Mississippi Freedom delegation went into the convention hall and took those seats, even though only 2 of them got to cast votes. And the Democratic Party went on to reform its delegate selection process because of that, to never again allow a segregated delegation. So I would say it's somewhat complicated, because it felt like a terrible betrayal at the time, but in the longer view, it really provoked an overreaction by the segregationists and won the point. And actually, our friend Julian Zelzer is working on a book about Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party right now. So when his book comes out, we'll all know the real deep story.
And a lot of those papers are also here.
Yeah, he's been here, I know.
I've read a little bit about LBJ, and they kind of strike me as a little bit of the same person, where they grew up in a small town, and their kind of rise to power. And they kind of seem to have fought for the same things. And LBJ obviously was embroiled in the Vietnam War. And I'm just wondering what kind of information you have on a friendship or a lack of a friendship, or what kind of relationship did he have with LBJ?
Well, I really have to defer to all the great writers who've covered that ground. You know, obviously Robert Caro, but also Robert Dallek, Nick Kotz. You know, Julian Zelzer has some of it in his book about the Great Society, The Fierce Urgency of Now. I only know secondhand. I didn't read much into that period of Humphrey's life, and what I read was not about him and Johnson, but like the way I found his great LSU professor, Rudolph Aberle, is one letter Humphrey writes to Aberle on the occasion of Aberle's 80th birthday. So I wasn't looking at him and Johnson, partly because they say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. But I say the second definition of insanity is trying to write about anything Robert Caro already wrote about. So that's why I don't have deep knowledge in that area at all. I'm sorry. I think you are right. The parallels of the small town, you know, Johnson's experience is just what I know really from Caro's work, but to put it sort of next to mine, Johnson's experience teaching at a Mexican-American school in South Texas, awakening something in his moral core, is very akin, I think, to Humphrey's year at LSU. So there are parallels. The other thing I want to say, though, is that, you know, as extraordinary as Johnson was on civil rights, Humphrey was there 15 years before Johnson was on civil rights. Johnson emerges in 1957 with his efforts to pass what ends up being a very pallid, but nonetheless important piece of civil rights legislation. Humphrey had been on this battle really from 1940 on.
Thank you, Professor. This is incredibly interesting and illuminating. You touched on it initially in your remarks about 1948 and the relationship that Humphrey had with Henry Wallace and other great civil rights advocates. But what's also interesting, and touched on it in describing him as a cold warrior, was Humphrey was unapologetically a supporter of Harry Truman's in 1948 over Henry Wallace. And I wondered if you might explain a little deeper that relationship. And then also, if I could just add this as well, whether or not the 1948 years or the years prior as mayor of Minneapolis were part of the time when he began to establish a relationship with Eugene McCarthy and then later Walter Mondale, and how that relationship may have been shaped and developed by his early years in Minneapolis.
Sure. Well, Humphrey and Henry Wallace had been incredible allies. Humphrey looked up to Henry Wallace when he had been Interior Secretary and then Vice President. Humphrey gave a seconding speech at the 1944 Democratic Convention for Henry Wallace to be renominated as Vice President, even though FDR, thinking Wallace was too liberal, arranged to replace him with Harry Truman. But the Cold War broke apart Humphrey and Henry Wallace. Basically, the Marshall Plan, the big aid package that Harry Truman created, named for Secretary of State, to give massive amounts of aid to Western European countries. There was a big debate in liberal and left circles in America about the Marshall Plan. Was it forcing Stalin to become confrontational when he otherwise might have been conciliatory, which is what Wallace believed? Or was it, correctly seeing the aggressive tendencies of Stalin and making sure that Western Europe would be materially secure enough that it wouldn't look to the Soviet model, for material stability? And Humphrey and Wallace completely parted on that issue, and they became political enemies because of it. And that's why in 1948, Henry Wallace, running on the Progressive Party, was incredibly brave on civil rights. He went down to the Deep South and held integrated rallies in defiance of law and spoke in behalf of civil rights. And Humphrey shared those views. And to be honest, if Humphrey hadn't succeeded and his allies in getting the Democratic Party to endorse civil rights in 1948 and to basically force Harry Truman to run as a civil rights candidate, Henry Wallace would have gotten the majority of black votes in this country, I have no doubt. Humphrey's friend Cecil Newman, the newspaper publisher, was running opinion polls of the black vote in Minnesota, just to take one example, all through the summer or the spring, heading into the summer, and then the fall of 1948. And until Humphrey's triumph at the 48 convention, Henry Wallace is getting the majority of the black vote in Minnesota. Thomas Dewey is finishing second, because of the Republicans as the party of Lincoln, and Truman is drawing the least of it. And so that's another element that's so important about the civil rights plank that Humphrey gets in the party platform, because what it does is it kind of forces Truman's hand soon after the convention to desegregate the military and desegregate the federal workforce. And then on election day, there's a surge of black voters, particularly in swing states, including, I think, Ohio is one of them, California is one of them, I forget off the top of my head the third, and that's where Truman's margin of victory comes from. And the last thing, I didn't find much about Gene McCarthy at this point in Humphrey's life, but with Walter Mondale was a preacher's son, a PK, as they call him, preacher's kid. He was a PK going to McAllister College and started to do some field work on Humphrey's 1948 senatorial race, which was the race he went into right after the convention.
Sam, thank you so much for having me here to talk about your book with you. I'm going to hand it over to Libby so we can find out what the audience can do next to acquire this fabulous book.
And thank you, Kathryn, and thank you, Libby.